I've been a search and rescue officer for the U.S. Forest Service for a few years now, and along the way I've seen some things that I think you guys would be interested in, so I figured I'd share some stories. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time, they just wander off the path or slip down a small cliff and they can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old stay where you are rule and don't wander off far. But I've had 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both bother me a lot, and I use them as motivation to search even harder on the missing persons cases I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for just a few seconds, and in that time, both the kids apparently wandered off. When the parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked her where her brother was, she told us that he'd been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, and that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the bear man, and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in the area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched that area for weeks, and it was one of the longest calls I've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, and she never came back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours, calling her name before they called for help. Again, we searched everywhere, but we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could have possibly gone because neither her mother or her grandpa saw her come down from that tree. A few times I've been out searching with a canine, and they've tried to lead me straight up cliffs. Not hills, not even rock faces. Straight, sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases we usually find the person on the other side of the cliff or miles away from where the canine had led us. I'm sure there's an explanation for this kind of behavior, but it is sort of strange. One particularly sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance, and she let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and a part of her had died with her daughter. I heard from another SAR officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. She couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. Another time, I was teamed up with another officer because we'd received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we figured he'd be. We found him trapped in a small crevice with a broken leg. It was not pleasant. He had been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was obviously infected. We were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He kept talking about how he'd been doing fine, and when he'd gotten to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment, and he was wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when he turned around, he said he had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he had fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night, climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible, muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it firsthand. One of the scariest things I've ever had happen to me involved the search for a young woman who'd gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out until late that night because the dogs hadn't picked up her scent. When we finally found her, she was curled up under a large, rotted log. She was missing her shoes and pack, and She was clearly in shock. Luckily, she didn't have any injuries, and we were able to get her to walk back with us to base ops. Along the way, she kept looking behind us and asking why that big man with black eyes was following us. We couldn't see anyone, so we just wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock. But the closer we got to base, the more agitated this woman got. She kept asking me to tell him to stop making faces at her. At one point, she stopped and turned around and started yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She wasn't going to go with him, she kept saying, and she wouldn't give us to him. We finally got her to keep moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic and deeper. It was almost insect-like. I don't really know how else to describe it. When we were within sight of base ops, the woman turned to me, and her eyes were about as wide as I can imagine a human could open them. She touched my shoulder and said, "He says to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck." I have a very small scar on the base of my neck, but it's mostly hidden under my collar, and I have no idea how this woman even saw it. Right after she said this, I heard that weird coughing sound right in my ear, and I just about jumped out of my skin. I hustled her to ops, trying not to show how freaked out I was, but I have to admit, I was really happy when we left the area that night. This is the last one I'll tell, and it's probably the weirdest story I have. Now, I don't know if this is true in every SAR unit, but in mine, it's sort of an unspoken regular thing we run into. You can try asking about it with other SAR officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably won't say anything about it. We've been told not to talk about it by our superiors, and at this point, we've all gotten so used to it that it doesn't even seem that weird anymore. On just about every case where we're really far into the wilderness, I'm talking like 30 or 40 miles in, at some point, we'll find a staircase in the middle of the woods. It's almost like if you took the stairs in your house, cut them out, and just put them in the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw some, and the other officer just told me not to worry about it and that it was normal. Everyone I've tried to ask since then, they just say the same thing. I wanted to go check them out, but I was told very emphatically that I should never go near any of them. I just sort of ignore them now when I run into them because it happens so frequently at this point. I have a lot more stories, and I suppose if anyone's interested, I'll tell some of them tomorrow. If anyone has theories about the stairs, or if you've seen them too, let me know. Hey guys, I checked back in tonight and was blown away by the staggering amount of interest my stories seem to have generated. I guess I should start off by addressing a few things that you guys brought up. There's been an overwhelming amount of people mentioning the similarities between some of my stories and those of David Paulides. I assure you I'm not trying to rip him off in any way. I've got nothing but respect for that guy. He's actually what inspired me to write this because I can verify a lot of the things he talks about. It's true, we do have a lot of these strange missing person cases, and most of the time, they aren't solved. Either that, or we find the missing people in places that they have no business being. I personally haven't been on many calls like that, but I'll share a few that I've seen, and a story my friend told me that relates to this. Most of the questions and feedback I received were about the stairs, so I'll touch on that briefly here. I'll also include a story later since everyone seems so interested. They come in a variety of shapes, sizes, styles, and conditions. Some are pretty dilapidated, just ruins, but others are brand new. I saw one set that looked like they came from a lighthouse. They were metal and spiral, a bit old-fashioned looking. The stairs never go up infinitely or farther than I can see, but some sets are taller than others. Like I said before, just imagine the stairs in your house, as if someone cut and pasted them, in the middle of nowhere. I don't have any pictures, sorry. It's never really occurred to me to try again after the first time, and I don't really feel like risking my job over it. I'll try again in the future, but I can't really promise anything. Alright, on to the news stories. As far as missing persons go, I'd say that about half the calls I get are related to that. The others are rescue calls. People who fall down cliffs and hurt themselves, get injured by fire. You wouldn't believe how often this happens, mostly drunk kids. Or people have been bitten or stung by animals and insects. We're a tight team, and we have veterans who are excellent at finding signs of lost people. But that's what makes these cases where we never find any trace of the missing people so frustrating. One in particular was upsetting for all of us because we did find a trace of them, but it just led to more questions than answers. An older man had been hiking alone on a well-established trail, but his wife called to say that he hadn't come home when he should have. Apparently he had a history of seizures, and she was worried that he hadn't taken his medication and maybe had suffered one out on the trail. Before you ask, I have no idea why he thought it was okay to go out alone, or why she didn't go with him. I don't ask about that kind of thing, because past a certain point, it doesn't really matter. Someone's missing, and it's my job to find them. We went out in a standard search formation, and it wasn't long before one of our vets found signs that the guy had gone off the trail. We grouped up and followed him, spreading out in a fan to make sure we were covering as much ground as possible. Suddenly, a call came over the radio, telling us to head back to the vet's location. So we went right away because this usually means that the missing person is injured, and we were going to need a full team to help them get out safely. We met back up, and the vet was just standing at the base of a tree with his hands on the sides of his head. I asked my buddy what was going on, and he just silently pointed up into the branches of the tree. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing, but there was a walking stick dangling from a branch at least 30 feet off the ground. The little strap on the handle had been looped around the branch, and it was just hanging there. There's no way the guy could have tossed it up that far, and we didn't see any other signs that he was still in the area. We called up into the tree, but it was pretty obvious no one was in it. We were all just sort of left scratching our heads. We kept searching for the guy, but never found him. We even brought our canines out, but they lost his scent long before this tree. Eventually, the search was called off. Unfortunately, there's other calls we have to attend to, and past a certain point, there's not much we can do. The guy's wife called us every day for months, asking if we had found her husband, and it was heartbreaking to hear her get more and more hopeless each time. I'm not sure why this call in particular was so upsetting, but I think it was just the sheer improbability of it. That and the questions that were raised. How the hell had this guy's cane ended up there? Did someone kill him and toss it up there as some kind of weird trophy? And we did our best to find him, but it was almost like a taunt. We still talk about that one from time to time. Missing kids are the most heartbreaking. Doesn't matter what circumstances they go missing under, it's never easy, and we always dread the ones that we find deceased. It's not common, but it does happen. David Paulides talks a lot about kids that search and rescue teams find in places they shouldn't be, or couldn't be. I can honestly say I've heard this kind of thing happen more than I've seen it, but I'll share one of the ones that I witnessed personally and think about a lot. A mother and her 3 kids were out on a picnic in an area of the park that had a small lake. One is 6, one is 5, and the other is about 3. She was watching them all really closely, and according to her, she never lets any of them out of her sight at any time. She never saw anyone else in the area either, which is pretty important to this story. She packed their stuff up and they started to head back to the parking area. Now, this lake's only about 2 miles into the woods, and it's on a very clearly established trail. It's almost impossible to get lost getting from the parking area to this lake, unless you're deliberately going off the path like an imbecile. Her kids were walking in front of her when she heard what sounded like someone coming up the path behind her. She turned around briefly, and in the 4 seconds or so she wasn't looking, her 5-year-old son vanished. She figured he had stepped off the trail to pee or something and asked her other two where he went. They both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the woods next to them, took the kid's hand, and led him into the trees. The two remaining kids didn't seem upset. In fact, she told us later that it seemed almost like they had been drugged. They were sort of spacey and fuzzy. So, of course, she freaked out and started looking frantically in the area for her kid. She's screaming his name, and at one point she thinks she heard him answer her. Now, obviously she couldn't go blindly running into the woods. She's got her other two kids with her, so she called the police and they sent us out immediately. We responded and start the search for him right away. Over the course of the search, which spans miles, we never found a single trace of him. Canines couldn't pick up any scent. We didn't find any clothing or broken bushes or literally anything that would signify a child being there. Of course, there was suspicion about the mother for a while, but it's pretty clear she was completely destroyed by the whole thing. We looked for this kid for weeks, with a lot of volunteer help. But eventually, the search petered out, and we had to move on. The volunteers kept searching, though, and one day we got a call on the radio, letting us know that a body had been found and needed to be recovered. They tell us the location, and none of us can believe it. We figure it has to be a different kid. But we go out there, about 15 miles from the site where he had vanished, and sure enough, we find the body of the kid we've been looking for. I've been trying to figure out how this kid got where he did ever since we found him, and I've never came up with an answer. A volunteer just happened to be in the area. He figured he might as well look in places no one else would think to, on the off chance a body had been dumped. He came to the base of a tall, rocky slope, and halfway up, he sees something. He looked through his binoculars, and sure enough, it's the body of a little boy, stuffed in a tiny opening in the rock. He recognized the color of the kid's shirt, so he knows right away that it's the missing boy we'd been looking for. That's when he called it in, and we were dispatched. It took us almost an hour to get his body down, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Not only was this kid 15 full miles from where he had started, there was no possible way he could have gotten up there on his own. That slope was treacherous. It was hard even for us with our climbing gear. A 5-year-old boy had no way of getting up there. Of that, I'm certain. Not only that, but the kid didn't have a scratch on him. His shoes were gone, but his feet weren't damaged or dirty at all, so it wasn't as if an animal had dragged him up there. And from what we could tell, he hadn't been dead that long. He had been out there for over a month by that point, and it looked like he'd only been dead for at most a day or two. The whole thing was unbelievably strange, and to this day is still one of the most disconcerting calls I have ever been on. We found out later that the coroner determined the kid had died from exposure. He'd frozen to death, probably late at night, 2 days before we found him. There were no suspects, and there were no answers. To date, it's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. One of my first jobs as a trainee was a search op for a 4-year-old kid that had gotten separated from his mom. This was one of those cases where we knew we were going to find him because the dogs were on a strong scent trail, and we saw clear signs that he was in the area. We did end up finding him. He was in a berry patch about half a mile from where he'd last been seen. Kid wasn't even aware he'd wandered that far. One of the vets brought him back, which I was glad for. I'm not really that good with kids, so I find it hard to talk to them and keep them company. As my trainer and I were headed back, she decided to take me on a detour to show me one of the hot spots where we tend to find missing people. It's a natural dip in the land near a popular trail, and people will usually move downhill because it's easier. It's a few miles away, so we hiked out there and got to the spot within an hour or so. As we were walking around the area and she was pointing out places she's found people in the past, I noticed something in the distance. Now, this area we're in is about 8 miles from the main parking area, though there are back roads you can take to get closer if you don't want to hike that far. But we are on state-protected land, which means there can't be any kind of commercial or residential development out here. The most you'll ever see is a fire tower, or a makeshift shelter that some homeless people think they can get away with building. But I can see from here that whatever this thing is in the distance has straight edges. And if there's one thing you'll learn quickly, it's that nature rarely makes straight lines. I pointed it out, but she didn't say anything. She just hung back and let me wander over to check it out. I get within 20 feet of it, and all the hair on the back of my neck stands up. It's a staircase. In the middle of the fucking woods. In the proper context, it would literally be the most benign thing ever. It's just a normal staircase with beige carpet, about 10 steps tall, but instead of being in a house where it obviously should be, it's out here in the middle of the woods. The sides aren't carpeted, so I can see the wood it's made of. It's almost like a video game glitch where the house failed to load completely and the stairs are the only thing visible. I stood there, and it was like my brain was working overtime to try and make sense of what I was seeing. My trainer came to stand next to me, and she just stood there casually, looking at it as if it was the least interesting thing in the world. I asked her what the fuck this thing is doing here, and she just chuckled. "Get used to it, rookie, you're gonna see a lot of them." I started to move closer, but she grabbed my arm. Hard. "I wouldn't do that," she said. Her voice was casual, but her grip was tight, and I just stood there looking at her. "You're gonna see them all the time, but don't go near them. Don't touch them, do not go up them. Just ignore them." I started to ask her about it, but something in the way she was looking at me told me it's best if I didn't. We ended up moving on, and the subject never came up again for the rest of my training. She was right, though. I'd say every 5th call I go on or so, I end up running across a set of stairs. Sometimes they're relatively close to the path, maybe within 2 or 3 miles. Sometimes they're 20, 30 miles out, literally in the middle of nowhere. And I only find them during the broadest searches or training weekends. They're usually in good condition, but sometimes they look like they've been out there for years. All different kinds, all different sizes. The biggest I ever saw looked like it came out of a turn-of-the-century mansion. It was at least 10 feet wide, with steps leading up at least 15 or 20 feet. I tried talking about it with people, but they just give me the same response my trainer did. "It's normal, don't worry about it, they're not a big deal, but don't go close to them, and do not go up them." When trainees ask me about it now, I give them the same response. I don't really know what else to tell them. I'm really hoping that someday I get a better answer, but it hasn't happened yet. This is another one that was less spooky and more sad. A young man went missing late in the winter when, realistically, no one should be going that far out onto the trails. We close a lot of these cases, but some remain open year-round, unless there's a shitload of snow. We didn't opt for him, but we had about 6 feet of snow on the ground that year. It was an unusually heavy snow year, and we knew it wasn't likely that we'd find him until spring when the thaw came. Sure enough, when the first big thaw came, a hiker reported a body a little ways off the main trail. We found him at the base of a tree in a pile of melted snow. I knew right away what had happened, and it scared the living shit out of me. Most of you who ski or snowboard or spend any amount of time on a mountain will probably have guessed it too. When snow falls, it doesn't collect as thick in the areas beneath branches. This happens most with fir trees because they have sort of a closed umbrella shape. So what you end up with is a space around the base of a tree that's filled with a mixture of loose, powdery snow, air, and branches. They're called tree wells, and they're not immediately obvious if you don't know what you're looking for. But we put signs up in the welcome center, big ones, letting people know how dangerous they are. But sure enough, Every year that we get an unusual amount of snow, at least one person doesn't read them or doesn't take the warning seriously, and we find out about it in the spring. My guess is that this young man was hiking and got tired, or maybe got a cramp from walking in the deep snow. He went to go sit at the base of the tree, not knowing that there was a tree well, and fell in. He got stuck with his feet up, and the surrounding snow caved in around him. Unable to free himself, he suffocated. It's called snow immersion suffocation, and it doesn't usually happen except in really deep snow. But if you get stuck in a weird position like this guy did, even 6 feet of snow can be lethal. What scared me the most was imagining how he must have struggled. Upside down in the freezing cold, he didn't die quickly. The snow would have formed a dense, heavy pile on top of him, and it would have been literally impossible to get out. As it got harder to breathe, he would have known what's happening. I can't even imagine what he was thinking in his last moments. A lot of my less outdoorsy friends want to know if I've ever seen the goat man when I've been out on calls. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, I've never seen anything quite like that happen. I guess the closest was that whole black-eyed man thing from yesterday's story, but I didn't actually see anything myself. However, there was one call where I had something kind of similar happen, but I'm not sure I'm willing to chalk it up to the goat man. We'd gotten a report that an older woman had fainted along one of the trails and needed assistance getting back down to the main area. We hiked up to her location, and her husband was just besides himself. He ran, well, I guess more jogged to us, and told us he had been a little ways off the trail looking at something when his wife started screaming behind him. He ran back to her and she was passed out on the trail. We got her on a backboard, and as we're getting her down to the welcome center, she came to and started screaming again. Finally, I was able to calm her down and ask her what happened. I can't remember verbatim what she said, but essentially what happened was this. She had been waiting for her husband when she started hearing this really strange sound. She said it sounded sort of like a cat, but it was off somehow. She couldn't figure out why, though. She went ahead to try and hear it a little better, and it sounded like it was coming closer. She said the closer it got, the more uneasy she felt, until she finally figured out what was wrong. I do remember this next part exactly because it was so weird that I don't think I could forget it if I tried. It wasn't a cat, it was a man saying the word meow over and over. Just meow, meow. But if it wasn't a man, it couldn't have been, because I've never heard a man make his voice buzz like that. I thought my hearing aid was going out, but it wasn't. I adjusted it and it still sounded all buzzy. It was awful. He was coming closer, but I couldn't see him. The closer he got, the more scared I was, and the last thing I remember was a shape coming out of the trees. I guess that's when I fainted. Now, obviously I was pretty perplexed as to why some guy would be out in the fucking woods chanting meow at people. So once we got down the mountain, I told my superior that I was going to search the area and see if I could find anything. He gave me the go-ahead, and I grabbed a radio to hike back to where she fainted. I didn't see anyone, so I kept going about a mile more. It was almost sunset at this point, and I didn't have any desire to be out at night alone, so I just sort of wrote it off and made a mental note to check it out again the next day. But as I was headed back, I started to hear something in the distance. I stopped and called out for anyone in the immediate area to identify themselves. The sound didn't come closer or get louder, though, but it sounded exactly like what the woman had described. Exactly like a man saying meow in this really odd monotone. As comical as this may sound, it was almost like that guy on South Park with the electrolarynx, Ned. I went off the trail in the direction I thought it was coming from, but I never seemed to get any closer. It was almost like it was coming from all directions. Eventually, it just sort of faded out, and I ended up giving up and going back to the Welcome Center. I didn't get any further reports like that, and even though I went back to that area, I never heard that exact sound again. I suppose it could have been some stupid kid out there fucking with people, but even I have to admit it was pretty weird. I got a little carried away with the number of stories I shared here, sorry about that. I wanted to get to the stories my friend told me, and he does have some good ones, so I'll post those tomorrow evening. I also have a few more of my own that I think you guys will like. Sorry to keep everyone waiting in suspense again, but hopefully the stories here make up for it.